So I have a question for you. Do you want to get sued? Do you want your church to get sued? Do you want to not hire staff because you're paying lawyers hundreds of dollars an hour? Do you want to go to your grave thinking about the survivor who will never return to church because of how they were treated at your church? I'm Carson Whitenauer. I'm the executive director of Uncommon Pursuit, and today I'm interviewing Boz Tchividjian. He has had to sue hundreds of churches and ministries and nonprofits because of the atrocious ways they treated survivors of sexual abuse. And Boz is going to lose money, perhaps, by doing this interview because he is going to help you not need to hire a lawyer to defend yourself against him and the survivor he represents, okay? But he's willing to do this. We're willing to do this because obviously having only one survivor not be traumatized by a church after they've been sexually abused at a church is worth it to us, and we hope it's worth it to you. So if you're a pastor or a deacon or an elder or whatever your title is in a church, the executive director of a nonprofit, you have fire insurance, you have health insurance, you do all of these things to prepare yourself for when disaster strikes. And if a sexual abuse situation happens in your context, you need to know how to handle it. And here's what usually happens. You're going to call your church lawyer and you're going to call your insurance company. And what has really astounded me is you might get advice from your own church's lawyer or from your insurance carrier, and they're going to tell you, here's our process. You've got to follow this. And when you go down that road, you are headed for a situation where your church splits, survivors are wounded, you're dealing with a lawsuit for months or a year, the payout gets bigger, the problems get worse, and I want to spare you from dealing with all of that, and Boz does too. So when I was leaving RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, they tried to get a non-disclosure agreement for me to sign one, and I reached out to Boz, and Boz helped me fight that so that I did not have to sign a non-disclosure agreement with RZIM, and I was able to protect my voice and speak out about the problems that I was seeing there and that I had experienced there. And so I know that Boz is compassionate, he's tenacious, he's wise, he's experienced. And if you are a leader of a church, this is a whole interview you need to watch with your whole leadership team and think through how are we going to prepare ourselves to handle this kind of situation correctly. So Boz, thank you for being here. This is a crucial topic. I know this morning, this afternoon, you have sat with a survivor who is on the wrong end of a situation with a church. Please introduce yourself and tell us why you're here today.
Yeah, Carson, thanks for having me on. I think having me back on because we've had prior conversation, and always appreciate engaging with you and deeply appreciate what you're doing now to not walk away from the church, but to help work with others in educating church leaders so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over and over again. So I just wanted to start with thanking you for that, because it's not easy work, and sometimes you don't make a lot of friends doing this type of work. So thank you for just the privilege of me being on this program with you. Yeah, my name is Boz Tchividjian. It's actually Basil Tchividjian, but my parents thought, let's, with a last name like Tchividjian, let's give him a first name like Basil and see how he turns out. So but I don't know how many years ago, after I was so tired of calling people and saying, can you tell somebody that Basil Tchividjian called? And it'd be like, Bob who? I'm like, okay, we're just going to go to Boz. B-O-Z. They still say Bob sometimes, but I'm an attorney. I've been an attorney since 1993. I started in around 2004, an organization called Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, which is an organization that, I won't give the whole story because we've done this before, but really sprung out of my years as a prosecutor who was prosecuting child sexual abuse cases and was just devastated by how many cases I had that were connected to some type of faith community. And as somebody who grew up in that church, I thought, man, I thought the church, at least I grew up to believe that the church was a safe space. And I realized not so true in the work I did. And so started Grace and began to help educate, train churches do independent investigations involving abuse within churches. And then in 2008, I left my law practice and went up to Lynchburg, Virginia, to be a law professor at Liberty University School of Law. That's a whole nother program. So we can delve into that another time. But my years there, I spent developing the organization Grace, and also training and equipping a new generation of lawyers who I found, even at Liberty, so many of them to be so passionate about the protecting vulnerable people and standing up with them and advocating for them. And so I created a course there that we taught for just about every year I was there, called Child Abuse in the Law. I believe it's still being taught today. But as time went on, Carson, I just, for whatever reason, I guess maybe it's a God thing, just became more and more convinced that I really needed to jump back into the practice and really advocate, use the law degree that I had earned, and use it to advocate for survivors. Because a lot of times when an abuse survivor is looking for legal counsel, they don't know who to go to. And oftentimes they go to the wrong person. They go to the lawyer who handles car accident cases. And those are great lawyers. Well, many, but this is not a car accident case. And so how you approach a case like this, not only in how you engage with your client who's been severely traumatized, physically abused, sexually abused, and usually spiritually abused, how you engage with your client, how do you make sure that this process for your client doesn't aggravate the already existing trauma that they've had to endure? How do you make this process perhaps even part of their healing? And then your knowledge about churches and how they operate and all the dynamics and cultural distinctions that go on inside of faith communities are really important for lawyers to know. And so if you just go to a lawyer who and I'm not minimizing car accident cases, but that people go to personal injury lawyers because it's a personal injury. But if that lawyer's never had much experience dealing with this type of case, I'm getting those clients who have been to those lawyers, who have been re-traumatized by those lawyers or their process, and now they're coming to me saying, I need help. And so I left in 2020, Virginia, moved back here to Central Florida, and in 2021 started this law firm, Boz Law, and that's all we do. We represent abuse survivors around the country in cases against youth service organizations, churches, schools, and I work with an amazing group of local counsel around the country. And probably the greatest privilege I have is getting to know and walking beside my clients, people who have been marginalized, ignored, and oftentimes vilified, finally finding their voice and being able to reclaim at least some of what was taken from them. So it's a long introduction, but that's sort of who I am and what I'm doing.
Now, it's amazing that you have dedicated yourself to coming alongside the vulnerable and helping them experience justice and restitution and restoration. And I know that your clients are grateful that you've chosen to do this. You could be doing so many other things, and for you to dedicate your wisdom and your experience to helping them just on their behalf, thank you. And obviously you represented me. So now look, if there are, the bad guys, the guys who don't care about the vulnerable, they're not watching this video. But this video is for people who would say, I'm a good guy. I want to lead my church well. I want to lead my nonprofit well. But there are a lot of red flags and pitfalls and dangers that people fall into because they're listening to the wrong counsel, the wrong advice, the wrong person, and it becomes a massive disaster for everyone involved. And so can you illustrate briefly for us, what is the cost when a church or a nonprofit gets the wrong counsel or follows the advice of the wrong insurance company and goes in the wrong direction when handling how to respond to a survivor?
Well, I mean, at the heart of it, the cost can be the ongoing and aggravated trauma inflicted on the survivor. I mean, think about it this way. By the time an abuse survivor steps forward to disclose what's happened to them, they've already, we oftentimes think of that's the beginning of the process. No, that's not. We don't know all that has gone on before that, that ultimately results in them making that really difficult, painful, scary step forward. And how the church responds to that, in fact, how the initial response is so critical. Because the initial response is going to be one of two things. It's either going to be welcoming and affirming, or it's going to be hesitating and questioning. And if it's hesitating and questioning, that will, I don't care what happens after that, that initial response will forever be impressed in the mind, the heart of that survivor, that their church community, the very community that they finally decided to step forward and disclose this very indescribably painful information, has not embraced them. And so that's at the heart of it. Then what makes matters worse is, here's the thing, Carson, most abuse survivors don't come to me as a lawyer until the doors have been shut and the windows have been closed at the church, where the church has just decided, we've done enough for you, or we're not interested in talking to you, or we just want you to go away. So what happens oftentimes is church leadership, they'll hear somebody, they'll hesitate a little bit, they'll question, but they'll provide some platitudes to the survivor. Yeah, we're going to pray for you, and we're going to look into this. More often than not, whether it's done intentionally or not, I can't read the minds of these folks, but it's just to placate this person, thinking that if we do enough of placating, they're just going to go away. And we can placate without it taking any real substantive steps to address this. And most survivors catch on to that after a while, because if you're months into continued dialogue with a church about your past abuse within that church, if you're months into it and still just dialogue, that's what's going on. They're placating you. And so at some point in time, one of two things will happen. The church will get tired of the placating and go, we've done everything we can. There's nothing more we're going to do. And they shut the door, close the window, and don't want to engage with this person anymore. Or the survivor will recognize what's going on and say, I'm done wasting my time with this because nothing's being done. And so it's at those moments where they oftentimes come to myself or lawyers who handle this work. Most of the time, victims are not the first response of a victim. Most of the time, the victims aren't wanting to run to lawyers. They're really wanting a church to acknowledge and advocate for them. Acknowledge them and advocate for them. And when they feel like the door has been slammed, some just walk away, never to talk to a lawyer. They just walk away, hide in their shell, oftentimes for the rest of their life, and never let go, aren't even able oftentimes to let go of that pain of not only being abused, but then being betrayed by their church. And I think I've said this before, maybe to you, but I've had more abuse victims in my 30 plus years dealing with this who have shared with me from churches, who have shared with me that what was more painful and more long lasting than the actual sexual abuse was the betrayal by the church. And that if you think about that, if you think how horrific sexual abuse is and all the damaging dynamics related to sexual abuse, and then you go, wow, this person who's had to endure that is telling me that what was more painful and more long-lasting was the betrayal of the church. That's, for me, when I heard that, and I keep hearing that, it's so convicting. And so it reiterates the importance of how churches respond. There's almost nothing more important than that, because here's the thing. Churches can take very proactive efforts to minimize abuse from going on within their communities. Absolutely. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But the reality is high-risk offenders will find their way into these types of environments. I don't care what policies you have in place. I don't care how stringent and proactive the church is. There's some are going to get through. And some, sadly and tragically, are going to exploit and abuse those around them. So then the key becomes, but how are we responding to that? Because we may not be able to catch 100% of offenders inside the church, but we can address and respond 100% of the time in a way that affirms and embraces survivors. And when we don't, we destroy those lives. And then, that's the most important. You said, what are the impacts? The other impact is the church just becomes it's an unsafe place. And as it gets out, and as more and more people hear about that, oftentimes people will move on to other places, or not want to have anything to do with that church. If you're looking for a church in town and you read about this church who had a lawsuit dealing with abuse of children in their church, and how the church was really defensive of it, and how the victim has been so traumatized by the church's response, or you go look at the other churches that may not have had those issues. Where are you going to go? But those are secondary. I really think those are secondary. The primary impact of a failed response is the impact on the very person who was hurt to begin with.
Again, if you're watching this and you're a good guy, you're a woman or a man in church leadership, and you would care about a survivor of sexual abuse, this is Christianity 101. This is the Good Samaritan. This is not, for advanced Christians. This is basic decency and courtesy and love for someone who, at immense cost and immense courage, is saying, I was hurt here. Will you help restore me? And it just seems so obvious that the response of someone filled with the Holy Spirit would be, of course, let us help. But sometimes I think what happens, Boz, is people say, we want to help, but we're afraid. We're afraid of what this means for our organization, our reputation, what's this going to cost? And they call their lawyer, they call their insurance carrier, and they say, here's what's happened. What do we do? And what are some things that, look, not every lawyer's bad, not every insurance company is bad, but what are some of the ways that people in your profession start to guide church leaders and they begin to go down the wrong direction? What are the red flags you see as a pattern over and over again?
I think the biggest pattern I see is that church leaders lean on and relegate how these types of matters are dealt with too much on the lawyers. And what I mean by that is, okay, here's a typical scenario. Church gets an insurance policy. They're talking to their insurance agent. Insurance agent says, hey, for another $3,000 a year, you can have this rider on your policy that covers sexual molestation. Oh, well, we never thought about that. We wouldn't think about that happening here, but maybe that's a good idea. So they pay their extra money to pay for this rider that covers sexual molestation. This is a side note, but it's an important one that I'm experiencing more and more now, is a lot of these insurance companies seem like they have a sort of standard cookie cutter sexual abuse rider, which is, a lot of them is, maximum amount is that you'll ever pay out is $300,000. That $300,000 is two major insurance companies that this is standard in their policy. That $300,000 it doesn't matter how many victims you have. If you had 35 victims, it's still a total of $300,000. As long as it's the same perpetrator, it's $300,000. I don't care how many victims. Even if it's a policy that, even if the abuse stemmed over 5 or 6 years, over 5 or 6 policy periods, these policies have been written to go at still just $300,000. So a lot of what's happening, and sometimes churches I don't think realize this, and sometimes they do, is they are underinsuring these types of claims. So when I go to a client and say, church has $300,000 insurance coverage, and, or let's say I have 3 or 4 clients and I have to say, church has $300,000. They go, you mean for each? I'm like, no, total. What do you do with a scenario like that? Oftentimes, as a result of that, we don't take the insurance. We file suit against the church because that's just not sufficient. But once you do get this insurance, now you've got this covered. And so let's say fast forward 6 months, you get a claim. Somebody steps forward. Whether somebody steps forward, whether you get a letter from a lawyer, but somebody steps forward. Most pastors do as they should, which is what we all should if we get some type of, any type of claim and we have insurance, is we provide that notice to the insurance carrier. Most of these insurance carriers will have lawyers that they retain. So the church really doesn't select the lawyer. The insurance company does. The insurance company has lawyers. A lot of these insurance companies have lawyers in every major city in this country. And that's all they do is insurance defense work. And so they'll call the lawyer and they say, here's a claim. We need you to defend, First Christian Church. Well, now First Christian Church has a lawyer. They're sort of happy because they're not having to pay out of their pocket for this lawyer because insurance is covered. But what they don't oftentimes understand is that lawyer is their lawyer. Even though insurance is paying for it, and even show at the end of the day, the insurance company, if we really want to be honest, this lawyer is really working for the insurance company because that's who's paying and that's where the money's coming from. But legally and ethically, that lawyer is the church's lawyer. So what happens, though, is as soon as that happens, these church leaders immediately just hide behind the law. Whatever you say, we're going to follow your advice. We're going to follow your direction. Sometimes even the insurance adjuster will go, wow, we don't like that idea, Mr. Pastor. We don't like the idea of you having a service where you the church confesses to this grievous offense and you take action to try to demonstrate genuine repentance. We don't want you doing that. That could hurt your case. And what happens? The church leader goes, well, if the lawyer's telling us that, okay, we're gonna abide by that. And so oftentimes now the tail is wagging the dog. The insurance company, through the church's lawyer, because the church could, if they knew this, but most of these lawyers aren't going to tell them. The church could say, wait a minute, Mr. Lawyer or Ms. Lawyer, you work for us. So this is what we're going to do. But they don't. And I find sometimes they don't know they can do that. Sometimes it's just convenient to hide behind a lawyer and to say, we wanted to do this, but our lawyer said we can't. And I see that time and time and time again. And here's the reality, the sad reality, Carson, is a lot of these lawyers who are hired by the insurance company, they don't care about this type of case. They don't care about church. They don't care about victims. And I don't mean they don't care. It's just, that's not their job. Many of them are Christians, so they have no understanding of the faith context and the layers of harm that come from this type of abuse. They just don't. They're just a hired gun. But the reality is church leaders need to understand that you have way more control over this lawyer than you think. Now, ultimately, I'll say this and be quiet. Ultimately, if you go to a mediation, let's say, and you're trying to settle the case, because the money's coming out of the insurance company's pocket, that insurance adjuster will probably be the one that makes the ultimate decision as to whether the case settles and for how much. And the lawyer will abide by that. But what people need to understand, and they don't, is that lawyer works for you. And you, church leaders, could do a significant, could take significant steps forward in demonstrating a godly response to all of this by being more proactive with their own lawyers and telling them, yeah, we want to take your advice. You're the lawyer, we're not. So we need to listen to you. But here, let's let you know this early on. We're going to listen to you, but within the confines of our faith. Anything that you ask or tell us to do that compromises our conscience or that is inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus, we want to let you know from day one, we're not interested. And you can say that, but more often than not, it's not what I'm seeing.
And that's where and this is why we're doing this interview, because I don't think people in congregations even understand this is how it happens. And, really, pastor, elder, deacon, do you want your church to be governed by your insurance company? Do you think that will help people fall in love with Jesus? If we as church leaders don't have the courage of conviction that we represent God to other people, and we will obey the Lord Jesus, no matter what an insurance company or a lawyer tells us. If we don't have that conviction, what are we doing in ministry? And is it clear now why survivors and anyone who hears their story is saying, I don't trust that church to do the right thing? It's that clear, but I don't think people are prepared for this. They don't know this is what happens. And Boz, you're letting us in on the inside of how things go bad.
are we spending more time listening and following the direction of our insurance company than we are the very victim who was abused within our community? And if that answer is yes, there's a problem.
Okay, so hopefully this is really clear. Now, one of the standard practices is a non-disclosure agreement. And I have found that you can say non-disclosure in about 30 different ways. I think lawyers are going to the thesaurus, or it's in some legal guide, or they're using ChatGPT. I don't know, but there's a lot of different ways to say you can never talk about this. Why do insurance companies, lawyers reach for an NDA as part of the boilerplate language? And what do you think about that as an advocate for survivors?
So yeah, it goes back to what you just said, is understanding the definitions that we're talking about. And you're right, everybody has varying understanding of what a NDA is. An NDA in general in the legal world is usually referred to as a confidentiality clause. Now, there are different types of confidentiality. So for example, when I settle a case, one of the provisions of the confidentiality clause is that the parties won't discuss the terms or conditions of the settlement agreement, including the amount. I just about always encourage my clients to accept that provision. In fact, it's in their interest. If my client gets X amount of dollars, the whole world doesn't need to know about that. And they don't, it's nobody else's business but their own. So the confidentiality as to the terms and conditions of the settlement agreement generally are fine. It's not a problem with that. Where you run into problems is twofold, in my opinion. Oftentimes, these confidentiality clauses also, at least the defense will attempt you to also agree to a provision within that confidentiality clause that prohibits you from speaking about your experience. Basically saying you can never talk about what led up to this settlement and all the facts behind that. And that is what most people would think of as a traditional non-disclosure. That is, this is hush money. You're paying me money to keep me quiet. And then there's another provision that doesn't get talked about enough, but in many ways is somewhat like a NDA, and that is what we call a non-disparagement clause. A non-disparagement clause is where they try to get you to agree that you won't say anything negative or, mostly they use the term negative, but there's some other terms, derogatory. You won't say anything negative, derogatory, and you list, synonyms for those terms about the church. And that's a problem too, because let's assume for a moment, because I've had defense lawyers go, hey, we're not going to put a non-disclosure. Yeah, we understand your client wants to, should be able to talk about it's their story. We don't want to put non-disclosure. I'm like, okay, that's great. Because we weren't going to sign one anyway, but that's great. You put that in there. But then you get the agreement and there's this non-disparagement clause. And they go, well, what's this? My client, what does what does disparage mean anyway? Carson, what's disparaging to you may be just truth to me. So if I'm trying to share my story about what happened at a church, there's going to be some negative things about that church that is going to come out in me sharing my story. Now, is that disparaging? Have I violated that provision of the agreement? So those two provisions, the confidentiality as to the what happened to you and or a non-disparagement clause, I think are generally, for me, are non-starters. If the other side tries to get us to agree to that. Once in a while, and I've had clients, and ultimately it's the client's choice. Really believe a lawyer who handles these cases, and I tell my clients from almost day one, you are in the driver's seat. Ultimately, these decisions are yours. We're done. You're done having other people make decisions for you. You can make these decisions. I'll give you counsel. I'll give you my 2 cents, but ultimately you make the decision. Once in a while, I've had some cases where the client says, listen, in order to settle this case, I want to be able to share my story. But talking about this particular church or this particular offender I have no interest in doing that. I just want to be able to share my story. So once in a while, we'll come up with a tweak to that non-disclosure, which says The client can speak as much as they want to whomever they want about their own experience, but they will not disclose the identities of the parties. And, for clients who don't think it's important to go out and talk about the identities of the parties and talk about just how this abuse impacted their life, that's fine. But there is another category of client who goes, no. This church is dangerous. That offender is still in power. I am not going to sign something where I can't disclose their identities. And I say, great, then we don't agree to that. Now, that could result in a case not settling and us having to go to court. But the reality is, I tell defense counsel, if this goes to court, it's all coming out anyway. It's all public. So take your pick. You want it to come out in court and some journalist sit in the trial and watch and write a story about it? Or do you want to trust that my client's going to, speak their story to whomever, whenever they want, but they'll do it in a way that's helpful to them, and they're not usually out on a warpath trying to destroy you. And usually at the end of the day, they back away from those things.
Yeah, I mean, really clarifying. And again, it is the survivor's choice. They're the ones who are being empowered here. I love that about you. And, every survivor is different and has a different situation economically, where they are on their healing journey, all of those things. But I do know that what motivates many survivors in coming forward is to stop the abuser from having access to more victims. And so they do want to be able to name that person, or in some cases that organization, for the sake of protecting others. And again, everyone's different, but I know that's common. So I know some people are on the edge of their seats now, and they're saying, okay, this all sounds awful. I don't want to, make these mistakes. You've had some churches respond well. They did get to the point of having you involved, which was already a failure in some ways. But then they tried to turn things around and said, okay, we're in a mess, but let's get out of this in a Jesus way. What's the top 3 or 4 or 5 kind of patterns you see when finally the pastor or the elder board or the deacons, they wake up and they say, we're going to do this the Jesus way? What are the top few things they do across the board?
Well, one of the things that I always try to help establish early on with a church that does end up deciding, hey, we want to do this right. We're scared to death. We don't know where this is going to land. Pastors are going, I don't even know if I'm going to have a job when this is finished. But we want to do the right thing. One of the things I tell them is stick to it, because this is a journey. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. And yeah, you might be all gung-ho, we're going to do this right now. But come back to me in 6 months and tell me how you're doing. And in 6 months, you might be going, I've done enough. I think we've done more than most churches, so I think we can be done with this. Because that's the standard. Like, we're doing better than most churches. Instead of saying, no, you said you're going to do it the Jesus way. You didn't say you're going to do it the better than most churches way. You said you're going to do it the Jesus way, which ultimately, if we look at the gospel, Jesus wasn't all about claiming, power. Jesus gave up power. Jesus gave up his reputation for something much bigger. And churches have to remember that. And so what happens is, even with a strong church leader, they say, listen, we're going to do this and we're going to do this right. And then 2, 3, 4, 5 months goes by and they're really struggling. And people in their congregation are going, okay, we've had enough of this. We don't want to do this anymore. More training? Come on, how much more training do we need? And they begin to slowly back away. Again, rationalizing to themselves, hey, we did something. And that's not the standard. So I try to say, keep your head down, press forward, because you're going to get a lot of resistance. You get a lot of resistance, and most of that resistance is going to come to you by people inside your own church. And some of those people who are resisting are going to be your big money givers. And when they say, listen, you need to stop, we need to move on beyond this, it's going to be really, really tempting for you to go, okay. Because sadly, in too many churches, the people with the pocketbooks are ultimately driving the train. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is, when churches decide to do it right, the question we sit down with them is, okay, what do you mean by doing it right? What are your objectives? And if the objective is, I at least try to help them develop that objective. And in general, I try to encourage them that the objective should be to find as much of the truth as you can, And once you have that, how do you demonstrate genuine repentance? And genuine repentance is not just, I'm sorry, it's taking concrete steps to demonstrate repentance. What are those concrete steps? For each church is going to be different. And then what do we do about the future? So that, acknowledging what's happened, addressing the past in a way that is substantive and personal. And then what do we do about the future? What do we do? Because one of the ways we demonstrate repentance to victims is to make changes, to ensure that they or anybody else in your church never have to go through that hell as this person did. So what are the structural changes that you're making, whether it's training, the way you hire, the way you monitor, all those types of things? Here's the thing, that all takes time. I mean, it takes time to get to the truth. And sometimes it takes money to get to the truth. If you get a independent investigation going, that's going to cost money. But okay, so you may not have as much money to send to this particular ministry or to send to the International Mission Board, but you know what? You're doing the right thing. That's going to take time, and the information that investigation unveils is probably going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be humbling. You will probably never feel as vulnerable as you do as you ever have until the end of these investigations. Pastors, you're going to be in a state of vulnerability, and you know what? We know pastors do not like that. But remember that this church doesn't belong to you. If you practice what you preach, this church doesn't belong to you. So it's okay. It's okay to be vulnerable. And then how do you demonstrate genuine repentance? That takes time too. You got to learn. Learn from survivors. Be a student of those who've been abused, who are willing to speak with you. Invite them to the table, not placating them and oh yeah, you're an abuse survivor. We want to hear you, almost like you're providing them some type of therapy. No. Like, humble yourself and realize that these people know way more than you do. And so you need to shut up and listen with a teachable spirit. You're the pupil. They're actually in a stronger position than you are because they know what they're talking about. Listen to them. Talk to them about ways to demonstrate repentance. Not because you just want them to come up with it. It's not fair to put all that on a survivor, but you also want to learn. You're trying to learn. And don't just invite the survivor that is related to the particular incident that you're addressing, because every church, Carson, sitting in the pews and who are active in the congregation, many survivors. Some of them pastors know about and leaders know about. Most of them you don't, because most of the time they're not going to tell you. And keep in mind that whatever you do in response as a church, those other survivors, many of which whom you do not know, inside your church and quite frankly outside your church, are watching. They're watching to see what you do. They're watching to see if this really is a safe space. And if it is a safe space, they may actually come forward. They may actually begin to feel like this is actually the refuge that I had hoped it to be, but I wasn't so sure until I started seeing how this church leadership began responding to this particular situation. I have a friend of mine, and I've shared this story many times, who she was invited to a new church outside of Philly. And it was a small church. And about a year before she got there, one of the members had been arrested for child sexual abuse. In fact, he had been caught abusing one of the, these bubbles. They'd be caught abusing one of the kids in the youth group. So this church, the issue was very raw. She told me, she goes, well, one of my first sermon series is going to be all about abuse. And I said, wow. And she said, so I'm probably not going to have a job after 6 weeks, but I just think it's really important. And she was an abuse survivor herself. Well, circle back a few months, and she calls me, and I said, well, how did that go? And she said, we have a church of like 50 or 60 people. She said, I calculated 80% of the women at some point in time during or after that sermon series came to me. 50% of them had never said a word to anybody about their own abuse. But they told me, you created a safe space, and I finally feel safe to tell somebody. One of those, if I recall correctly, one of them was an 80-year-old woman who had been sexually abused as a child and had never told a single soul until now, because she finally felt safe. And to me, I was like, on one hand, I love that with my friend, that she created that space, that it was risky. It was very risky, but she did the Jesus thing. And as a result of that, people came forward. An 80-year-old came forward. The flip side of all that is, oh my goodness, what type of environments have we created in the church where somebody who's 80 years old, who's been a part of church life for most of her life, has never felt safe enough or comfortable enough to approach a church member or a leader to share about the most traumatic aspect of their life? We can do better than that. And so creating that space is really, really important. But you got to learn how to create it. And you got to read, you got to hear from the experts, but most importantly, talk to those survivors who are willing to speak with you and learn from them. And then make changes. Be ready to make changes. And you know what? Some of the changes you're going to make, not going to be very popular. You're going to get more resistance. The policies that you've always had in place, and now we're going to say we're going to run background checks on everybody. And that's a whole other topic. Background checks are certainly not foolproof because they only catch people who've gotten caught. But it's a good start. But, when you say, okay, we're going to start, one of the very first changes we're going to make is, it's very easy, very basic. Anybody who's volunteering in our church, anybody, is going to go background check. Well, now Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who are in their 70s, who've been volunteering with the nursery for the last 30 years, are really offended. Because they're like, you're having me do a background? You don't trust who I am? And what if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are big money givers to the church? Do we make an exception for them? Or do we say, well, it's a new place around here now. We are changing this culture, and change has to start somewhere. So either get on the train or get off the train. But we're not going to start making exceptions for you or this person or this person. Well, they've been doing this a long time. We're going to be consistent. So you're going to get resistance. People get resistance about, I don't want to come listen to this person from Grace talk about child protection. We did that a couple of years ago. I think I know enough. I mean, there's constant resistance. And at the end of the day, what I try to encourage pastors is this. If protecting children and other adults in your church isn't part of the very DNA of your community, then you really have to re-examine what gospel you're claiming to embrace and follow and preach.
It's really powerful. Our church is working with Grace. We've had a wonderful experience. I think if you're a pastor watching this, you probably want to pause the video and just go on Grace's website, put in a contact form and say, I don't want to be preparing my church to handle abuse after we've already had a problem. I want to make sure that's already part of our culture before it becomes a problem. And I need to go check the stat on this, but I remember reading in the past week, 1 in 4 women in high religious marriages have experienced intimate partner violence. And when I saw that stat, I just wanted to cry, thinking about how many women I see at church every Sunday who are experiencing intimate partner violence, and how does our church become a resource to them? And what would it look like for every church to be engaged against domestic violence? And I think we have to ask ourselves some questions. Why is there resistance to protecting our kids from abuse? I mean, it's just crazy to think that that would be an area of a church fight. And so I think there have to be some compassionate and sympathetic ways to not offend people and say, look, of course we trust you. And because we trust you, we want you to help lead our church in this. Would you be the first to get background checked and tell everyone how it was no big deal because you're such respected members of our community? You could help lead the change here and keep our kids safe. And we know you want to keep our kids safe. You've served in the nursery for 30 years, watching out for bad guys. Would you help lead us into this new culture? And I think that there's got to be a way to connect with people's compassion and basic Christianity and have them embrace this new culture. But we'll have to figure that out.
Some of the resistance you get is, oh, and I see this in the modern day church evangelical world. Oh, you've just been infiltrated by those liberals, or that's woke. Why are we doing that? Come on, you're going overboard about this. I hear that all the time, and that is infiltrated to the very core of so much of evangelicalism that I worry about. Even though these same people are talking about being pro-life and pro-family, but when you start talking about this type of stuff, and you talk about intimate partner violence, they don't want to hear that, especially inside the church. When you talk about adult clergy abuse, which is, in my opinion, epidemic proportions in this country, where clergy members are grooming and ultimately victimizing adults, mostly women. They don't want to talk about those types of things. You're exaggerating, or why are we focused on this? We need to focus on all those bad things out there in the world that are trying to destroy the church, instead of realizing, no, you got to start right here. And if you truly are a Christian, you should understand that, because that's at the heart of the gospel. We start in our own heart and how messed up we are. And that's the same approach we need to take in our churches. And if we don't take that, then maybe, I don't know what type of brand of Christianity it is that you're following, but it's certainly not Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. I mean, I am a sinner saved by grace. I'm more than that. I'm an image bearer made by God who loves me. But yeah, this is Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I mean, these are really foundational things. And I really don't want to be involved in a culture war on this one. I want to just stay connected to the stories of survivors I've talked to who have wept with me about how they were victimized initially and then how their church treated them. And there are so many resources. Julie Royce puts on the Restore Conference, which is an amazing experience. And then the videos are available on YouTube for free. That is an amazing training resource. Grace is available. And again, I think we just ground this not in terms of Republican or Democrat, but loving our neighbor and compassion and doing what's right and following Jesus. And there's going to be battles to be fought here, but I think there's some very basic scriptural language that church leaders ought to be familiar with and using to help their congregations go on this journey to follow Christ. So, Boz, what would you say would be just some final words of advice for a pastor, deacon, elder, anyone in church leadership, ministry leadership? What are some of there's always the remaining 10% that sometimes we hold back, and I want to get that 10% out of you. What is that 10% you would say to just encourage them to handle this in a way that honors survivors, holds perpetrators accountable, and glorifies God? Like, what is it? What's your heart here for them to realize, or a practical step they need to take? Give us that final 10%.
The parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, if we think about that, what did the Samaritan do? I mean, he noticed, he moved towards, he got in the dirt to lift this injured person who technically should have been his enemy, and then cared for him long term, not just short term, long term. What does that look like in your church life? And it may not have been easy for the Samaritan. We have this belief that maybe the Samaritan was this very wealthy guy and could do all this. I have no idea. This could have been very painful with the Samaritan. Maybe he gave his last dollar to help continue to provide this person care. We don't know, but it was difficult. It wasn't easy. And I think that was the point of the parable, is not only is he moving towards a person that probably hated him, but all that he did was not easy. And I just, as pastors, know that this is not easy stuff. I can't decorate this for you to go, man, if you do A, B, and C, it's just going to all be wonderful. It's not. But if you truly love people, if you truly believe that everybody is a child of God, that they all hold value, then one of your top priorities in developing the culture of this church is to ensure that people know that And that every practice, every policy, every ministry within the church points to that. I think we sometimes forget that. We're all about God's glory, which is great. But in the midst of that type of theology, we oftentimes dehumanize the very people that Jesus says are his image bearers. And so knowing that and understanding that, and then when these situations do surface, and I don't care how hard you work to try to minimize them from happening, most pastors in their career are going to be faced with something like this. Just realize it's going to be hard work. And realize it could, depending on the church you're in, could end your career there. No pastor wants to deal with that. I get it. It's their career. But do the right thing. And I can't tell you, Carson, how many times I've just told leaders, and it's very simple, but I think they know what I'm talking about most of the time. And that is, at your heart of hearts, do the right thing. Do the thing that you know Jesus would call you to do in this situation. Don't rationalize it. Don't look at it through the lens of lawyers or insurance agents or rich people in your church. No, it's you and Jesus sitting there. And Jesus is asking you, what's the right thing here? What's the right thing here, Carson? What's the right thing here, boss? I think at the heart of hearts, we know what that is, but we resist it because it's difficult. It can contribute to chaos. It gets a lot of resistance. And so we rather move towards something much easier, way easier to do ministry overseas and have all this other stuff, which is all good. But you can't ignore what's right here at home. So yeah, go back. Jesus gave us the parable of the Good Samaritan I'm sure for many, many reasons. But the older I got, the more I realized in this work really spoke to me and continues to speak to me. And in many ways, it's a simple story, but in many ways, it's not so simple because what the Samaritan did was not so easy. And it required investment, not only in time, talent, and resources. And so we need to understand that. And if that's who Jesus held up to us as who we should be following, and the type of what we saw in the Good Samaritan, that personally, because our churches, Carson, and you know this as well as I do, our churches are littered with people laying on the sides of the roads. And most of the time we're walking by without even noticing them. We've got to start by noticing. And noticing is not just enough, because the priests and Levi, I think they did notice, but they had other more important spiritual things to take care of. But it's noticing and then moving towards. And if we had that, and that's the incarnation, isn't it? God noticing us and moving towards us so much that he became one of us. Well, that's all he's asking us to do, at least in this topic, is be incarnating here. Step towards, you notice, move towards those who are hurting, and invest. Even if it expends the life of your church, because the gospel expended the life of Jesus. So if moving towards those who are hurting results in even expending the life of the church, so be it. That's the gospel we claim to preach and love. And you can do it. You can't do it alone. Do it with God's carrying you through it. And you do it by creating a community now. Start now by creating a community who gets it. So when these things happen, that resistance we've been talking about is almost non-existent because everybody has been educated and they go, this is what we've been learning about. Let's put our policies in action here. And that can happen because I've seen churches do that. And if you do that, side benefit, much stronger likelihood you're probably not going to get sued by me because you would have handled it correctly.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's where I thought we could start this, and maybe now we're ending it, is don't get sued by Boz or someone like Boz. And if it just comes down to who are you most afraid of, you can ask, am I more afraid of Boz representing a survivor? He's tenacious and experienced, and he's not going to give up in his pursuit of justice. Or can I talk to my insurance company and say, we're doing the right thing here? Who do you want to be afraid of, if that's what it comes down to? Do you want to be afraid of what the journalists will write about your church in the papers? Do you want to be afraid of what your reputation will be for the rest of your life? But really, we don't want to live by fear. We want to live because we love God and we love our neighbors. And Jesus has changed our hearts to live not for ourselves, but to live for God's glory and for the benefit of those around us. And again, this is just basic gospel stuff. So I know I have a lot of work to do. Every church has a lot of work to do. I know there's a lot of competing priorities, but this is the moment. You will regret not taking this action. Today, go and call Grace or another organization like Grace and start preparing your church. And if you're in the middle of a crisis right now, get some outside help and get some counsel to go through this in a Jesus way. And if we do this, my friends, if we do this, we are going to hold perpetrators accountable and we are going to restore survivors. And this is going to be something that you will be grateful you took action the right way for the rest of your life, instead of living with a life of regret for the people you damaged to maintain your power and position. We don't want that.
I encourage pastors or leaders who are listening that there can truly be beauty that comes out of the ashes. I've seen it. I've had a front row seat at it. And so your church, why don't we as pastors and leaders say, listen, the ashes are the ashes, and maybe we can prevent them. Sometimes we can't, but we are in the business of seeking the beauty out of the ashes. And that can happen. It does happen.
That's a great final word of hope and encouragement and inspiration that this is not all about pain and suffering. This can be about joy and hope and encouragement and reconciliation and seeing God do miracles. And that's why we did this video. And so, Boz, thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom and your expertise. If you've watched this, I hope you've really been encouraged. You need to go and watch this video with the leadership team of your church and sit through it and talk about it together and say, God, what are our next steps? How can we do this right? And what a great thing that's going to be for the safety of your church and the safety of the vulnerable. It seems like an easy thing to do. So thank you for watching, Boz. Thank you for your time. I'm going to have a link to your website, of course, but people know how to find you. And really grateful that you were here today to share your wisdom.